Hi everybody, in an earlier video we saw how to use the fetch API to make a request to an endpoint and get some data back and do some basic things that were more around learning about the fetch API and less on building something end to end. Well, with this coding it up, we're going to change all that. We're going to build a very simple example that uses the API provided by the very popular Unsplash image service to display a random image every time on page load. And we'll be touching upon a whole lot of things that you might have already seen, but maybe even touch upon some new things that will be beneficial to you as you continue your journey as becoming a web developer. So let's get started. And so before we get too far, I just want to give you an example of what we'll be creating by the end of it. So here you can see that on the browser, there's a big yellow page with like a text that says display random image and some labels and an image that gets displayed. And this image is coming entirely from the Unsplash service. So every time I refresh the page, you'll now see a different image getting loaded, and you go also see the associated information about the image photographer and the link to Unsplash also being shown right here. So nothing too complicated, but it's kind of cool, very simple, and it gives us a great feat, great feet? No, it gets our feet wet in being able to use the fetch API to do something more realistic than what we've been seeing before. So to get started, I'm going to first, what we have set up here is I have a blank page already created, and I don't want you to go and create all this from scratch. So what I've created essentially is the bare minimum needed to have a page up and running. And to get all this information, just go to bit.ly/random unsplash. If you don't have it open as a description below, you can copy and paste it from right here, bit.ly/random unsplash. And when you go there, what you will ultimately see is a code pen that I have started that you can then fork and make, start building the things from where I'll be building. Now you can use CodePen, or you can do what I'm doing right here, which is copy all of this into your own HTML page that is in your code editor of choice, which for me is VS Code. And so the page I'm seeing here that's displayed is a direct representation of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that I will be writing or building upon on what you see in VS Code. All right, so now that we kind of have like the building blocks for the starting point set, it's time to start figuring out how do you want to actually build this API. So the first thing to do is that this data is coming from Unsplash. And Unsplash, like many popular developer-focused websites, has documentation on how their API works, and every website has their own way of doing all of this. So let me go to Unsplash's website and just kind of walk you through how they do the whole developer onboarding and being able to access their API. So I'm going to find their API developer section. And the one thing you need to do is sign up. It's a very quick process, and basically authorize yourself as someone who can call their API and make requests for. You'll be given a really long series of letters and characters called your client ID, and it is something that you will need as part of being able to call their API. Different APIs have different ways of doing this. Many don't require any extra steps. You just have an endpoint to call, you get some data back, but some of the more involved APIs, like what Unsplash provides, do require you to do a little bit of extra authentication and registration to make sure that you're on that they are aware that you are going to be making some requests. So let's go to documentation, and a logical place for what we're trying to do here. And oftentimes when you're here, you'll get to see information on APIs available, what we can do, and what we sometimes cannot do. In this case, our goal is to display a random image from their API, and because this is probably a very common request they actually have get random photo displayed right here itself, very easily for us to be able to access. And so I'm just clicked on the get random photo, and here I can see the path for it is really /photo/random, and there are some additional parameters I can pass in as part of the URL that I provide. And the coolest part, which otherwise would require extra steps, what Unsplash provides is an example of what a response looks like, what the JSON data looks like. And so if I were to call, I'm going to zoom in a bit so you can see more clearly. If I were to call this API for getting a random image, the data that gets returned is a JSON object with all of these various fields, everything from like information about the camera being used, the location it's been taken, and information about the image itself with the various sizes of it, the links I can use to send a visitor to, getting more details about the image, and also information about the photographer, the creator themselves. So a lot of really cool information displayed by their API. So Unsplash makes it very easy for us to kind of figure out what the API path needs to be to able to get a random image. And of course, the additional step, which again is very unique to every particular developer API site, but for Unsplash, is authentication. And so if you typically have to use a client ID or register before you can use your API, there's a very good chance you need to read up on their authentication approach. And for Unsplash, it is fairly straightforward. So they ask for your access key, which is your client ID. And then all you really do is you call their API, https://api.unsplash.com/photos, and then whatever path you need from the API we saw earlier, and then your access key area is where your client ID will come into play. And this is the URL we'll be passing into the Fetch API, and we'll see more of it in a few moments as we start to actually build our example. So let's go ahead and, I've already created my client ID. It's something that I've already saved and have it over here on my screen. And so if you haven't done that yet, I highly recommend you to pause for a moment, register your app, and go ahead and create the client ID that you need to be able to make all this work. And so just pause the video, go ahead and create your client ID, register and get a client ID. It's all free. It's very, very quick. So I'll wait for you to do that and unpause it once you are ready. Okay. So now that you have your client ID, and we looked at a basic overview of the Unsplash developer documentation on how this is all going to work, let's take a look at what exactly we have going in our page right here. So we have some styles, nothing too fancy, just some basic things to give us the look and feel that we want. And then we have our HTML, which is our heading element, which displays random Unsplash image. We have a div element, which is called image container. And inside of it, we have our image element itself, whose ID value is Unsplash image. And then we have a URL basically wrapping it so that when you click on the image, you get taken to something that's more detailed. So it's an A element there. And lastly, I also added information about the details about the image itself, who the photographer is or the creator, and the URL to where they might need to go if you click on their name, and also the link to Unsplash itself, just so you have all these details. And so this is our starting point. And now what we're going to do is take all the information we kind of saw earlier in the developer documentation and go ahead and make an API call, get some data back, and have this, all this black and placeholder area, the black boxes and so on, be replaced with real, actual information. And so the first thing I'm going to do is we need to create the URL schema that needs to be there. And so we kind of saw that when I go to our documentation, and let me go to authentication again. It looks a little bit like this. So I'm going to copy this just because it's one easy way of being able to make sense of this all. So I'm going to do let endpoint equals, and I'm just going to go ahead and paste it in using the string literal syntax, and I just pasted it in without any modification. And where it says your access key, I'm going to go ahead and specify the access key that they have provided as part of the client ID. So I'm going to let client ID equals, and let me go ahead and copy and paste it. I am copying this. And let's see, I'm copying across machines. So let's see if this works. And is it working? Copy. And paste. Okay, it did work. There was just a small lag as it probably went from who knows how many servers to get to where it needs to go. And so I have my client ID, and I'm going to replace your access key with the client ID value. Okay, so I have that, bracket client ID. All right, so we're good to go here. And so now what we're going to do next is, now that we have the client ID, is make a call to our Fetch API. So I'm going to do fetch endpoint, and let's see, we are in a good spot right here where the fetch endpoint is being displayed, and of course it's fetch, it's not actually a function. So I'm going to do a .then. Remember, it's a promise-based API. I'm going to do function response, and let's see what's going to be here. And we're going to do essentially a return of the response.json in a JSON format. So I'm going to stop right here and just make sure that everything, if I refresh the page, everything still looks good. So no errors, nothing blatantly wrong is appearing. So let me go ahead and just console.log our response.json to make sure that nothing seems off here. Console.log response.json. Now, the reason I do this is because different people have different styles on how they do error handling. In my case, I'm always a little paranoid that as I'm writing code, especially if I'm doing a live video, that something might be wrong, something may be kind of going off track. And so in this case, the promise, everything seems to be reasonably good. Like I'm not seeing any major errors here. So we'll just keep it at return response.json. And of course, the next one is that we want to now process this information in some interesting way. And so now I'm just going to call this JSON data. So then function JSON data, and then let's go ahead and at this point start populating the various data that we have received. Now at this point as well though, like I think I'm going to do one last check of JSON data to make sure that everything looks good. Console.log, refresh the page, and I can now see JSON data being returned. Now what I'm seeing here looks a little different though, right, than what we might have seen earlier when we were looking at the Unsplash API documentation for getting a random image. And so it'd be the documentation, let's go to get a random photo. And that is partly because the syntax for getting a random photo is one that I'm using is not the fully correct one. So let me go to random / client ID, and now I'll go back to display random image. And now if I refresh this page, this looks more like the documentation we've seen right here. Now, the reason I call it out is as part of me building the example out earlier, I made the mistake of just copying the documentation directly from the authentication page without mapping it to the actual random call I need to do. And I kept getting this really weird, bizarre errors where I was getting data, but it wasn't doing the right thing. And I was a little surprised because I was going to be mapping it to the data we see in the documentation itself. And that was the reason behind it. And so I want to call it out because as part of any API you're using, make sure to double check that the endpoint you're using is making the right call to the right level of API access you're going for, not just the root access that may be called out by our documentation. All right, so now we're in a good spot here. So we know our JSON data is being displayed. We know the correct data is being displayed as well. And so let's go ahead and start mapping data points with actual DOM elements that we have on screen. So first I'm going to do let image element. Let's create some variables to make this simpler. Document.query selector / unsplash image. That is our image element that we can see right here. The next one will be let image link equals document.query selector, and it's going to be image link. This will be to help us set the URL for the image itself. The next one will be the creator, the person, the photographer who did all of the hard work on getting the image that we ultimately end up seeing. So document.query selector and hashtag creator. Okay, so here we have 3 DOM elements, and now all we need to do is start populating it with the data that we ultimately get returned from our API call. So the first thing I'm going to do is set image element dot source, set the image element to be the data that we want. So JSON data, and now where do we go from there in terms of JSON data and displaying the image? There are several ways you can do this. One way is by kind of inspecting the return JSON object like I currently have displayed in the console. I'm going to close that for now. The other approach, which I recommend if the website does a good job with it, which Unsplash absolutely does, is to look at the documentation itself. And so what I want is the image URL. And so looking at the data they provided, let me zoom in a bit so you can see more clearly. I can very clearly see that they have, after I zoom in, let me get to random photo. Get a random photo. I can now see that the URL that I want for all of the images is under URLs regular, and that seems to be the path to the image that I'm currently looking for. And so that's what I'm going to do. JSON data dot URLs dot regular. Okay, so that is our first information. Let me save this document and refresh the page, and you can now see that as I did that, the appropriate URL is being displayed. So let me refresh the page again. You can see a different URL appearing image appearing every single time, which is pretty cool. This is, we can see our example slowly starting to come to life. Now, of course, clicking the link doesn't do anything. So let's go ahead and fix that by saying image link dot set attribute is the href attribute. And we're going to set it to, let me go back. What does it look like? Let's see, links and HTML. That seems like the appropriate one I'm going to go to. So JSON data dot links dot HTML. And similarly, I'm going to go ahead and just finish out the work on getting the creator information showing as well. So creator.innerText equals, in this case, JSON data.user.name. I remember seeing it earlier, but you can see if I go to user name, you can see the full name of the user there. And likewise, we want to take them to their URL when we click on it, which our example provides an affordance for, where we have a name, like also a hyperlink. And so let me go ahead and set creator.setAttribute. And just like before, it's the href attribute that is the element, and that is the attribute that specifies the URL to go to. It'll be JSON data.user.portfolio underscore URL. Okay, let's see if this all worked out correctly. Refreshing the page, and you can now see a different images being displayed. And you can also see that I can see the author information. If I click on the author's name, I get to see additional pictures that they have taken. And Unsplash, of course, takes me to Unsplash. And if I click on the picture itself, I see a larger version of the image that is available from the Unsplash API. So that is pretty cool. And as always, when we're doing work with promises, we do want to do error handling as well. So I'm going to do function error and just make sure we capture any errors that may happen as part of it. So error and plus error, if any errors happen. In this case, everything seems to be working fine, so we don't have to do that, but just in the interest of completeness, it's good to do this. So now we have a fully working explanation. Now, before we wrap this up, we have a working example. There's one change that I want to do, and it's based on where we kind of left things off by looking at how we work with the fetch API earlier. Now, we know that fetch is a promise-based API, and we have all of these then blocks to kind of sequentially go through each stage of getting the data, refining it, and making it do things in a more asynchronous fashion. Now, there's a syntax that is more commonly used these days besides this function syntax, especially for cases where we have a function with returning some data. And that is a version of using arrow functions to simplify some of this a bit. And just for completeness and also for making sure that you are best informed for how to do things in the future, let's go ahead and convert some of these function calls to the more arrow syntax, arrow function based syntax. So I'm going to replace function. It's going to be response. It's always the argument equals the arrow function. And instead of having a return statement, it'll just be response arrow function response.json. And that's it. That is all I will provide here for this particular call. And then similarly, where it says JSON data, I'm going to take the function keyword out. And because this has multiple lines as opposed to just a single line, bulk of this is going to be still similar. The function call is gone, and the arrow function replaces it, and you still have the brackets, which because these are multiple lines. And lastly, you can also use brackets for single line as well if you enjoy the having extra verbose content there, which is neither right nor wrong. Follow the style guide that your teams may have already created. So in this case, I'm going to have error, and then it's a single line. I could have done exactly this and remove the brackets and move this line to the top, but I'm going to keep it with 2 lines just to show you that it's totally okay to do that. All right, if we refresh the page, again, nothing has really changed. Our example still works exactly the same. It's a little bit more readable. I'm generally not the biggest fan of arrow functions, but I do think when it comes to the fetch API and using the promise-based syntax it uses, that this is actually a fine approach for being able to simplify the number of lines of code that we have. All right, let's go to our slides, and there you have it. A quick overview of building an example mostly from scratch. The CodePen link, I highly recommend you go there and copy and paste that as your starting point. But if you want to type everything out manually as well, by all means go for it. You can even simplify things or go even more elaborate and modify what I provided to suit your particular needs. But the important part really is the typical workflow of understanding the API call you want to make by going to a documentation site for whatever the API creator's content looks like. In this case, we're using Unsplash, so I kind of walked through the main things about the Unsplash documentation that is relevant for me in using the fetch API call, which is always going to be an HTTPS endpoint, which depending on the API calling might require an authorization ID, which is a client ID or app key or whatever terminology that particular API is using. So you need to provide that as part of your API call. And lastly, as we saw with the random random API, there's a path you need to specify as well. So /photos/random, which depending on the API you're using will be definitely customized for what you're doing there. And then we just kind of built the whole thing out. We used the fetch API. We did some DOM manipulation where we set some attributes and set some inner text and some values to match what our data looks like. And lastly, I kind of showed you the old way of using the function-based syntax to using the more newer arrow function based syntax. And there's another approach using await and other related keywords, which we will look at in a future video, so stay tuned for that. And with that, if you have any questions, please post in the forums at forum@group.com, where I and others would be happy to help you out, answer any questions about web technologies, about requests, fetch APIs, and all the other fun stuff in between. If you like this video, tell your friends and enemies all about it. Hit subscribe to be notified of other videos that will be coming out very soon. Follow me at Krupa on Twitter to be notified of cool updates. And lastly, buy my book. If you enjoy video content, if you enjoy seeing some of this, there's a book form in both Kindle and paperback editions of related content on animations or React or arrays or any other thing I might have written about by the time you see this video that I think you should totally check out. So go do that right now. And with that, I will see you all next time.